Part 1. They say cowboys feared nothing, not the weather, not bandits, not even dying alone in the dirt. But there was one thing that made even the toughest ranch hand squirm in his saddle: women. Not because they didn't want them, quite the opposite. But out there on the dusty edge of civilization, women meant risk, real, life-altering, terrifying risk. Let's start with the obvious: disease. In towns where bathwater was reused until it turned gray and doctors learned medicine from a pamphlet, getting close to someone, really close, was a gamble. Saloon girls didn't have access to health checks. Many didn't even have access to soap. And when infections spread, they spread fast. Cowboys learned early that one night of bad decisions could leave a man coughing in his saddle for weeks, or worse, visiting the barber surgeon, where treatment usually involved hot irons and regret. But the fear went deeper than illness, much deeper. Marriage on the frontier wasn't romance. It was survival, a union forged by necessity, not love letters. If a cowboy married, it meant staying put. It meant trading wide-open ranges for fence posts and laundry lists. And once kids came into the picture, well, now you weren't just responsible for yourself. You were expected to provide, in a land where your next paycheck might depend on whether your horse breaks a leg. That kind of pressure could crush a man. Then came the silent killer of many trailside marriages: pregnancy. There were no hospitals in the wilds, no trained midwives, no emergency wagons. If a woman went into labor, she did it on a straw mattress, with her husband holding a lantern and a bottle of whiskey. And if something went wrong, which it often did, there wasn't much anyone could do. Death in childbirth wasn't rare. It was expected. For some cowboys, losing a wife and baby in one night turned them into shadows of men. Others never recovered. Some never even tried again. So you started hearing things in bunkhouses and on cattle drives. The older cowboys would sit around fires and tell stories about getting tied down, about friends who used to ride hard and laugh loud, until they got married. And then they got quiet, worn down, tired. Some even turned mean, as if the prairie itself had drained the joy from them once they had a ring on their finger. And for younger riders, the message was clear: marriage could be the end of everything. Free, of course. Not every man swore off women. Some tried to make it work. They'd build a cabin, raise animals, even try to send their kids to school, if there was one. But the odds weren't great. If disease didn't get you, poverty might. If not that, loneliness. Women often left, too. Some couldn't stand the isolation. Some ran off with someone richer. Some just disappeared. And in towns where women were few and men were many, that kind of betrayal stuck. A cowboy might spend months working for the promise of a home, only to come back and find it empty. Or worse, inhabited by another man. That's where the real fear set in. Not just fear of women. Fear of what they represented. Change, responsibility, vulnerability. Love on the frontier was a coin toss with a loaded pistol. And most cowboys had seen too many bad bets. So they kept riding, kept moving. They laughed at the idea of weddings, rolled their eyes at letters from sweethearts, and stayed just drunk enough not to care. But deep down in those quiet moments, before sleep, they remembered the girl they left behind, the cabin that rotted without them, the child they never saw. And that's the part no one tells you. Cowboys didn't fear women because they were weak. They feared women because they were strong enough to matter. Part 2. Marriage was a gamble with loaded dice. Marriage on the frontier wasn't just risky. It was a full-blown gamble, and the house rarely lost. A cowboy might ride into town with a pocket full of dust, a busted hat, and 3 good teeth. But if he had a steady hand, a quiet charm, and didn't smell too bad, he might catch the attention of a ranch widow, a homesteader's daughter, or someone tired of loneliness. That part wasn't the problem. The problem came after. Once a man put a ring on it, or more likely, carved a promise on the inside of a tin cup, everything changed. Suddenly, he wasn't just chasing cattle or dodging rattlesnakes. He was fixing roofs, hauling water, and waking up to crying babies instead of coyotes. And if the crops failed, if a blizzard hit early, if your horse dropped dead with winter still ahead, there was no backup plan. Your wife couldn't ride out and pick up supplies, not safely. Your children weren't old enough to help, and you couldn't just abandon them, not without becoming the kind of man no one wanted to share a campfire with. So you stayed. Even when the walls creaked, even when the meat ran out, even when you saw your wife looking out the window like she regretted every moment. And let's not forget, women weren't just seen as partners. They were seen as potential liabilities by some ranch owners. Bringing your wife to a camp meant fewer bunk spots, more mouths to feed, and a distraction for the whole crew. Some outfits wouldn't even hire married men. Too soft, they said. Too cautious, too tied up. So a cowboy had to choose freedom or family. And most didn't see a way to have both. Even for those who stayed single, the fear lingered. You might trust a woman with your story, maybe even your heart. But could you trust her not to leave when the going got hard? Could you trust her not to fall ill, or worse, bring danger to your door? Because there were stories of women carrying more than heartbreak, of entire towns brought down by one kiss, of ranchers who lost everything chasing promises written on perfume paper. So cowboys kept their distance, and when they didn't, they paid for it. Part 3, women meant change. And change meant death. They didn't say it out loud, but everyone knew. When a cowboy settled down, part of him died. It started small. He stopped riding with the others, spent more time fixing things, fences, wagons, the roof that never stopped leaking. He wasn't at the saloon on Friday nights. He didn't ride out for the roundup, and slowly, the jokes stopped. His name faded from the camp stories. At first, the others teased him, called him married man, Mrs. Johnson, or just homeboy. But deep down, they knew what it meant. He was out of the brotherhood now. He had responsibilities, weak spots, a woman back home, maybe a child with his eyes, and weakness didn't belong on the frontier. Change was dangerous. In a world where your life depended on instinct and routine, anything new was a threat. Marrying a woman, that changed everything. How you worked, where you lived, who you rode with. And the West wasn't kind to men who lost focus. There were stories of cowboys distracted by family, forgetting to load their rifles, nodding off during guard duty, missing signs of ambush or rustlers. Men who once rode tall in the saddle, now buried in shallow graves because their minds were somewhere else. Even the environment didn't care about your love life. Droughts came whether you were married or not. Wolves didn't skip your cabin because you had a wife inside. And sickness, that silent, crawling thing, didn't care who you kissed goodnight. So the old cowboys warned the young ones, don't let your heart write checks your boots can't cash. But there was more. Some feared marriage not just because of change, but because of who they became when tied down. One man said he used to laugh so loud coyotes answered. After marriage, he barely spoke. Another confessed he once rode for 12 days straight through snow and wind. After settling down, he couldn't ride more than a mile without looking back. The West demanded men who could disappear. Marriage made you visible to enemies, to debt collectors, to bad luck. A wedding ring was a marker. It said, this man has something to lose. And in a land full of desperate people, that made you a target. Even those who loved their wives carried fear like a second saddlebag. What if she fell sick and you couldn't help? What if she died in childbirth and you couldn't forgive yourself? What if the baby cried through the night and you didn't have the strength to keep smiling? Love made you soft. Soft men didn't last long out there. That's why so many cowboys rode alone. Not because they didn't want a woman, but because they were scared of what would happen if they did. They'd seen it happen too many times. The cowboy who sold his horse to buy a cradle. The one who broke his back plowing land that never bore crops. The one who left the trail to raise a family and ended up coughing blood behind a broken-down cabin, holding his dead wife's shawl. Women weren't the enemy, but marriage was a slow death, wrapped in a pretty dress and a warm fire. So, when cowboys talked about freedom, they didn't mean just the open land or the stars above. They meant escape from the weight of attachment, the fear of loss, the heavy chain of caring too much. Because once you care, you can be hurt. And out there, hurt was just another word for dead. Part 4. The loneliness they chose and the ghosts they carried. They chose the road, not because they didn't crave touch or warmth, or the sound of someone saying their name softly at dusk. but because they were afraid of what came after. Cowboys feared women, yes, but more than that, they feared what love could take from them. So they rode. They rode through windstorms that cut like razors and deserts that cooked the soles off their boots. They rode under stars that looked like promises no one kept, across lands where bones stuck out of the dirt like bad memories. And all that time, they carried silence. Silence where a wife's laughter could have been. Silence where a child might have cried. Silence where a life, a whole, real, grounded life, might have bloomed. Some tried. They'd meet a woman in a prairie town, spend a few nights sharing stories and biscuits, maybe leave her with a small silver trinket and a promise never meant to be kept. Then they'd vanish come morning, saddle creaking, eyes hard. Others stayed longer, built cabins, planted beans, tried to live soft, but the ghosts of the trail never left. Every gust of wind brought memories. Every creak of the door at night sounded like an ambush. The West didn't let go. It haunted. Some cowboys would never admit it, but their fear wasn't just of women. It was of what those women represented. Commitment, vulnerability, mortality. A wife meant needing someone. Needing someone meant being broken if they left. And in the West, people left, by choice, by death, by time. So they stayed distant. Even when they dreamed of warmth, they'd watch couples in town, smiling over coffee, or patching up each other's coats. And for a flicker of a second, they'd feel it, that ache, that wondering, what would it have been like? But then they'd remember the stories. The boy who married at 20 and buried his wife at 21. The man who returned from Cattle Drive to find his homestead burned, his family gone. The friend who got sick and his wife had to watch him waste away with nothing to do but pray and dig. They remembered, and they kept riding. They filled the hollow with noise, hooves pounding dry dirt, fire popping in the dark, harmonica songs with no words. They carved notches into saddle horns, marked trails with initials, told jokes that didn't need punchlines. Some carried keepsakes, a ribbon, a photograph, a name etched into a belt buckle, things they'd never speak of, but always kept close. Ghosts they chose to live with. Not because they liked being alone, but because they feared being left more. A few lived long enough to wonder if they made the right choice. Old cowboys with bent backs and clouded eyes, watching children run past, watching their friends fade one by one. They'd sit on porch steps with their dogs and talk to the wind. Sometimes they'd tell a young drifter, find someone, hold on, don't end up like me. But by then, it was too late for them. The trail had taken everything, or still, in the rarest of cases, one would return. Gray in the beard, dust in every wrinkle. He'd knock on an old door. She'd open it. She'd pause, hand over heart, and maybe, just maybe, she'd let him in. But most didn't get that ending. They died as they lived, alone, proud and silent, not because they hated women, but because they loved too hard, too deep, and feared losing more than they could bear. And out there on the frontier, with nothing between you and the edge of the world, that kind of fear was worse than any gunfight. That was the choice. To love and risk death, or ride alone and die slow. Epilogue. The things they never said. They never wrote it down. No diary entries about aching hearts. No poems scribbled in the margins of old trail maps. Cowboys didn't put feelings into words. They packed them like salt pork and shoved them deep into their saddlebags, buried beneath ammo, tobacco, and rusted tools. But if you watched closely, you could see it. In how they looked at wedding dresses hanging in a dusty shop window, in how their voices went quiet when a baby cried from inside a homestead, in how they'd sit just a little too long after supper, staring at the fire like it owed them an explanation. They lived in a world too rough for softness, and yet it haunted them. They saw what happened when a man cared too much. He hesitated. He froze up. He made mistakes. And in the West, mistakes got you killed. A snakebite didn't wait for you to think of your wife. A gunshot didn't pause because you had a daughter. So they told themselves they didn't need it, didn't need her, didn't need love, didn't need a home. But every fence post they drove into the earth felt like a question. Every time they moved on without saying goodbye, it was an answer they didn't want to face. They feared women, not because of who women were, but because of what they represented. A reason to stay, a reason to stop running. A reason to stop pretending they were made only for the dust and the saddle. Because if they stopped, even for a moment, the grief would catch up. They'd remember the one that got away, or the one they left, or the one they never even tried for. Just stared it across the room and said nothing. The West demanded strength, but it was a narrow kind of strength, the kind that didn't cry, didn't hold, didn't hope. And so they buried their tenderness beneath layers of grit. They wore their loneliness like a duster, heavy, familiar, weather-beaten. Sometimes a cowboy would fall asleep under the stars and mumble a name in his dreams. Nobody asked. Nobody ever asked. But they all heard. Somewhere, out there in that wide empty land, were letters that never got sent, gifts never given, names carved into bark where no one would ever look. The West had no mercy for sentiment, but it didn't erase. It just made sure it stayed hidden. There were exceptions, of course. A few cowboys settled down, married, had kids, laughed loud and often. But even they carried a kind of tension, like they knew the land was watching, waiting to take something back. And often, it did. A wife lost to fever, a child swept away by the river, a fire in the middle of the night. Love in the West was always at risk. Maybe that's why it felt so rare and so precious. But for most, the end came quietly, a final ride, alone, a collapsed barn roof. A storm that didn't pass. And when they were found, days or weeks later, someone would say, he kept to himself, or he never did settle, or just, he was a cowboy. But somewhere in their pockets, if you looked close, you might find a dried flower, or a scrap of ribbon, or a ring too small for their hands, a story untold, a woman unnamed, a life unlived. And maybe that's the most Western thing of all. To ride toward the sunset not because you want to, but because there's no turning back. Not when the thing you fear most is the one thing that could have saved you.